Our next guest on Pacific Brothers is All Black number 919. He's also been appointed in a first ever role. He's New Zealand Rugby's first Pasifika engagement manager, but that's because he's one of the best people to take on this role. He's a legend of Auckland and All Black rugby. Severe tama Eroni Clarke.
Malo lau le soifua maua. Ma le lagi ba ma, e mai sia oi lau sunga Oscar, e o pape foi le pa ia ma le mamalo le tātou tangata atu motu. Malo lava.
Mahalo, foi. I wish I knew the flash words to say back to you, but let's just say that you cleared the space for us. Bro.
Amen, that's it.
Me and you were born in Samoa in the same year. We were probably babies on the island together. You probably ran past me a few times. When did you come to New Zealand?
We came to New Zealand in 1971, and I think though it was already predetermined by my father, who was a scholarship student earlier. To Wanganui Boys College, and I think having that experience, there was, I think, I would believe there a dream there, more than just the doors of New Zealand opening to us as Pasifika people, but I think Dad, having that experience, realised that here's a better opportunity providing for his children and his family when they're born. So here we are. And
was it the West that you went to straight away?
No, we did the migrations. Obviously, we stayed with family in Mangele on Beta Drive, from Beta Drive to Grey Lynn, and then Grey Lynn.
You had a house in Grey Lynn too?
Grey Lynn.
What street?
Bright Street. And then from Grey Lynn, we moved to Owairaka. And it was kind of there, by that stage, I was 7 years old, and it was living in Owairaka, going to Wesley Primary, but it was my first experience. There was a buzz in the house, and Dad sat my brother and I down as we watched an All Black rugby game.
And you're how old at this time?
7 years old.
So you're 7 now,
And as we were sitting there watching, Dad said...
What was the game?
He said, watch the number 11. It was Brian Williams. It was Sir Brian. They were playing Scotland. It was the 75 waterlogged game.
Was this the flooded test?
Yes, it was. And so sitting there, first game, watching him score 2 tries, and of course that first experience, it was a buzz for me. And of course, so at that time...
And it was Tuifasasina Brian Williams.
Sir Brian Williams. And I think like every young child from there, you know, you dream about playing for the All Blacks, playing this game of rugby, and so that was where it started for me, though.
But you said something interesting to your dad, and what was his answer?
Very interesting, because, of course, again, the dream that education was going to be it for his children. So I asked him, so, Dad, how do you become an All Black? And, of course, Dad paused for that brief moment and then looked over at me and he said, son, you have to be brainy.
So what did they do to
So, of course, for me, everything was about, wow, looking at those All Blacks, thinking, they're so brainy guys.
They're geniuses.
I mean, look at Sir Brian, he's a lawyer.
I love how your dad didn't deter you from that and still managed to push his own agenda.
Absolutely. And I think given that he, obviously in his past, he's represented Samoa at the South Pacific Games, and so it was already in the blood. And I think Dad was always going to be... I think it wasn't long after that he started playing club rugby for Suburbs.
Mighty Suburbs.
The Mighty Suburbs, so the West. And so from Owairaka, we moved from there to West Auckland, where we did a lot of our growing most of the years. So,
And Henderson High, where you were the head boy, I understand.
The great school of Henderson High. We were, and when my first year at Henderson High was Michael and Timor. I think those are our seniors. So already there was again the inspiration by these role models, leadership as well. And of course, years later at Henderson High, I was the head boy there.
At 21, the year's 91. New Zealand's still a very different place, and then you cracked the Auckland team. What was that like?
Yes, it's...
again, following in Sir Brian Williams' footsteps.
Yeah, absolutely. And in those days, you knew that if you made the Auckland side, you were that much closer, even a half a step in front of the rest of New Zealand, of making the All Blacks. So I think for me, being in that environment very early in my rugby career, it certainly helped to straighten out a lot of the bumps. And as a young, that it's not just about the natural ability. There was also the hard work, the discipline.
And Auckland legend, and we were all waiting for you to crack the All Blacks because, you know, especially Auckland supporters. What was it like when you got that call?
It was down in Napier. Interesting, that's where, I suppose, in our history, with the Clarke history, that's where I suppose the Clarke history really started was in the Hawke's Bay. So it's quite amazing that years later that the All Black trial happened to be in Napier. And what was really interesting, that in that trial, the last final trial, I played for the Saracens and I scored a try in that game. From the moment I touched the ball, and I kid you not, over the top of the voice of the crowd that were there, the 10,000 people that were there that day, you can clearly hear my mother's voice screaming, "Go, Ronnie! Go, Ronnie!"
It just cuts through.
It just amazes me. I'm sitting there watching him and hearing this, "Go, Ronnie! Go, Ronnie!" I'm thinking,
They've got that frequency, that just manages to cut through, whether you're at a crowded church, a hall, across the shopping mall. Yeah.
So it was. So I suppose that makes that game even more special as well. So, it was. And having the family, as Pasifika, that you don't just... And I think this is something that this is what my mum said to me after that. She said, "Son, do you know that every brown-faced brother can flick up their collar and say, that's a brother that's made it. To consider, if they can do it, so can I." And I think that's, as I realised there, that there was that responsibility of, to whom much is given, that much is required of. So I suppose on one hand it can seem like a burden, but I think on the other hand it's an exciting opportunity to be there in those places, to be able to open doors.
What are your best and worst memories from your All Black career?
I think most people would say being dropped from the All Blacks was probably one. I think the wonderful thing about my journey was years later coming back and being selected back in the All Blacks again. I remember that time I'd been out of the All Blacks for 5 years. The incumbent All Black didn't come back for the trials, and I think the All Black coach said something like, "Well, that All Black's not going to be in my All Black team." So naturally I thought, wow, I'm playing really well, so maybe it's me. And it was quite so we played the All Black trials. I thought I played well, but I'm gathered in the room now. We're all gathered in the room, and we're waiting for the manager to stand and name the sides. He was going to name two teams. The first one was going to be the All Black team. The second one was going to be the New Zealand 15, who would have to, from there, get on a bus and travel down to Hamilton to play against England. And so he began to name the All Blacks. He got to 15, Christian Cullen, 14, Jeff Wilson, 11, Jonah Longmore, and 13, it's not my name. And, there are moments in your life where, in whether it's sport and anything, where you just feel like it's a kick in the stomach. And you're just at those crossroads thinking, why do I try? And then I thought, well, maybe I'm in the starting lineup for the second 15. He names the second 15. I'm not in the starting lineup either. Yeah. So it's around about now where you feel like now you just want to throw in the towel and just walk away from it all. And then I hear my name get called out in the reserves of that team, and I'm thinking there, great God, I'm in the reserves of the reserve team. And I thought, I really wanted to walk away, but I realised I couldn't because I was still contracted, so I had to get on this bus to go down to Hamilton. Yeah. But it was the wonderful thing for me that happened that when I got on the bus, and while I was down there, while I was on the bus again, faith is an important element, as you know, in my life. And I picked up a word for today, and this devotional that said, "Get up, get going." And I thought, are you kidding me? Get up, get going.
It was God talking.
It was just reading it through, I knew from that instant that I was in the right place. And just whole demeanour, whole attitude began to change.
Wow.
Now, the beautiful thing, I was down there and I was rooming with Tana, and we fast forward years later, both Tana and I retired. We're at this conference. Tana was the guest speaker, and Tana starts getting asked the question, "Tana, who's the hardest centre you've ever marked?" And Tana goes, "Oh, Eroni Clarke." And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, Tana, you know it. Well, I'm there at this conference because it's a conference for heart children, and my son, EJ, is my heart child baby, and we're there. And then Tana goes on to say, but furthermore, I want to say that we were both part of this New Zealand 15 side years ago, and we both been dropped from the All Blacks. And the greatest thing that I watched Ronnie, because I knew he wanted to get back in the All Blacks, and he had been out of the All Blacks for years, but every day I'm watching him, and I'm realising that nothing seemed to faze him. Nothing seemed to faze him that he's not in the All Blacks. Every day it just seemed like he'd approach this rugby professionally in that really high manner that he always does. And I'm sitting there in the conference, and my mind's casted back to that time in that moment, and I realised that was one of the hardest moments of my life. as Tana said those words, I realised that even the lowest moments of your life, that you can still be an influence and a role model to others. Because Tana finished by saying that
he didn't know what was going on.
He had no idea, because he finished by saying it put me in good stead and helped me in good stead to being a good All Black captain years later. And I thought, wow, if that was my one role that God had me for in that moment, then in that instance, I've achieved what I've been, for that. The wonderful thing about going down to Hamilton, I think it was a couple of weeks later, we both got called back into the All Blacks again. So it kind of just really, for me...
It was like a test.
It was a test. It was, if you like, it was just one of those moments where you can even think that even the darkest valleys that you might be walking through, that you can have that ability to influence in a real positive way.
I remember the game when you got your Achilles, and was it Carlos had kicked ahead and you went to chase it and you just collapsed.
Yeah.
And it looked really innocuous, and then later we found out it was an Achilles. How much of a handbrake was that on your career, and how did you get through that?
I'd never been to a World Cup before then, Oscar. He was my first opportunity as an incumbent of that season. Yet in the first
99
World Cup. And in the first game of the Super 12 that year, or Super Rugby that year, that I jumped and I felt like somebody had kicked me in the back of the calf. And as I fell, I realised, and as I looked down at my sock, I could see this dent in my sock lining down my foot. I knew straight away I blind my Achilles. So it was a long road. It was at the end of it, I wasn't selected. Of course, again, it's hard. You're thinking about.
How long were you out for?
6 months.
Yeah,
6 months until I played again.
Yeah.
Oscar, there's that old saying. There's a silver lining to every cloud, and I think for me was one of the greatest pleasures that I had was that I stayed in New Zealand and played NPC. It was Michael's last year. I always get emotional when I talk about this. But it was Michael's last year, and I got to, when you've travelled with someone for a long time and you respect somebody, and someone that you love and you respect and everything else, and you get to be at home and you get to play in his last game, and you win the NPC together as well. I think for me, and then after that game, he got a huge gash in the game, and so he required a lot of stitching. So I waited for him. The team had finished and all had left and gone to the aftermatch function, and so now we're sitting in the Auckland changing room in the big huge spa bar. And it's just the two of us. This was 99, and it's just the two of us. Everyone had gone, and we're sitting there, and we're reflecting over such an illustrious career that this man has had, and the impact that it's had across globally for just young people, and not just in sport.
Just Samoans.
That's right. And I think that was a wonderful thing in that moment for me, to be there and just being part of that moment for Sir Michael, for Savai. And so I think I see that as very, very special, and I was privileged to be there and just to be part of that group that won the NPC, but in that changing room, in that moment, and just say...
Which you would not have had if you'd been at the World Cup.
Exactly. So I think for me that was a wonderful... I put that on par with anything, having just to share those last moments with Savai, with Lauli, and just talking about such of the career he's had and some of his highlights, some of his lowlights of his long career. So I really do. And I see that very special and privileged to have done that.
We lost that World Cup anyway. There was that terrible semi-final against France. I mean, maybe no team could have done... the French that day were
on fire.
They were just
absolutely
freaks. But I always loved the way Jonah conducted himself after that game. Everyone's gutted. All Blacks are on their knees.
That's right.
And Jonah stayed on his feet and he applauded them.
Yes.
And that was so hard for everyone in New Zealand to do.
Absolutely. And that's the sort of role models that you really love. And we talk about special people. We talk about losing friends, losing Jonah, losing even Dylan over the years. Special people that you've journeyed with in those touch point moments in your life, and then having to bury those.
It's too young, huh?
Too young. So yeah. So I think that's those are kind of things that you tuck away in your mind, and you realise that you got to move on. And I think the wonderful things are that the imprint that they've left in history and the impact that they've had over the years have been amazing. Jonah will continue as well. Dylan, these amazing men. There are other young men. We think about Norm
Sione Lauaki, Norm Berryman.
We talk about Jared Cunningham. These
Curtis
guys,
Haulu.
Curtis.
Yeah. Nicky Allen going back to the 80s.
Yes,
but,
absolutely.
They all deserve to grow into old men and sit at the end of the bar and reflect on the golden years. And they never got that chance. Taken far too soon.
Absolutely. True in those two.
Forgot to mention Jerry Collins in that list.
Oh, Jerry.
As well. So tell me about your new role. This is very exciting, and I'm really happy to see New Zealand Rugby appoint this position.
It really is, and we're seeing New Zealand Rugby again. I mean, the motto for New Zealand Rugby is to unify and inspire. And if we're talking about diversity and inclusion, this is a wonderful step for not just for New Zealand Rugby, but in sport. I don't think there's any. It could be a first right across the national sporting bodies where we have a Pasifika, a specific position where Pasifika can have a channel to seeing their aspirations come to fruition.
Is there an equitable role for Māori in this, or is New Zealand Rugby looking after that in other ways?
Yes, they are, and I think for us as Pasifika, we need collaboration. We need to understand the tuakana Teina relationship that we have with Māori, with tangata whenua. And I think that's the wonderful thing, that we can continue to move forward, that we do work together with Māori.
Final question. How does rugby need to evolve, and what could happen to the game, which is under a lot of pressure if it doesn't?
Yeah, I think COVID it's impacting organisationally, because it's now asking of ourselves, who are we? And this is New Zealand Rugby. How can we be in terms of diversity and inclusion? Now, we now have a Pacific engagement manager. So being in those conversations and allowing us to say, well, this is for Pacifica, this is what it looks like. And this is what it can, if we want to engage better, this is what it looks like. So really now we do have a place at the table. Because why? Because the organisation are a lot more open to hearing, how do we need to move forward? COVID has thrown everything up in the air. It's caused us a whole reset. So it's a really good place to be in sport and in rugby, and I suppose life in general now, to really be able to advocate for Pasifika.
Right. So use this as an opportunity.
That's what it is.
So Tama, Eroni Clarke, you were a hero growing up, and you still are. Thank you so much.
Malo lava. Whawhitei.
Malo.